Hi, everybody. Got a really great show for you today. I was joined by a really cool guest in Johan Norberg, award-winning economist, author, and historian. I asked Johan to come on the show to discuss a few things. I wanted to get his thoughts in terms of why is it that capitalism gets such a bad rep these days, and with increasingly people in different Western societies getting more romantically attached to this concept of socialism. I wanted to get his thoughts on it, specifically because he's such an internationally regarded economist. He's from Sweden himself, and many people typically these days look at Sweden as a bastion for, as what many people deem to be a socialist model working well. So I wanted to get his thoughts on that in terms of, are people correct to perceive Sweden as being that model? I also wanted to ask him about something which is really being pushed by different circles at the moment, different, let's say, international private financial organizations, which are kind of masquerading as public service entities, which they're not, in this concept of stakeholder capitalism. So I wanted to ask him if he had any thoughts on stakeholder capitalism. And for me, it's something that seems to be capitalism for the rich and socialism for everyone else. So yeah, he had some interesting things to say on that. And then just a few different issues, a few different things we discussed. So I gained a lot of value from it. If you do, I would encourage you to subscribe to the channel and share it. Enjoy. Alrighty, so I have the privilege and pleasure today of being joined with by economist, historian, and author Johan Norberg, arguably most well known as the author of the book In Defense of Capitalism, which is 20 years old now. And most recently, Johan's most recent book came out last year, Open, the Story of Human Progress. Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute and Executive Director at Free to Choose Media, where I probably came across Johan for the first time in the different video series that he's been doing over the last few years, which are available on YouTube, and I'll link them in the description below. So Johan, thanks very much for coming on the show. How's things?
Hi, Luke. Thanks for having me. Good, thank you.
Good. So Johan, I suppose, do you want to start off by letting some listeners and viewers that may not be familiar with your work, just to tell us a bit about a bit of background about yourself and what is it that you've been setting out to achieve with your career and journey in economics?
Yeah, well, you can say that I'm a person who's a little bit obsessed with progress and what makes it possible, economic and social progress around the world, partly because I never really appreciated it and I never really understood it until, well, I wrote that book on capitalism that you talk about, because I used to believe in, present day life is awful, stressful, ruins your health and the environment. We should go back to some good old days in the past. But then I got a little bit worried and a bit of a wake up call when I started reading history, and I started reading the history of my ancestors in northern Sweden as well, and realizing that the supposedly good old days before big business and modern infrastructure, international trade, was terrible. Bad weather meant crop failures, meant that they starved. So they didn't live happily ecologically, they died ecologically. And that set me on this path of looking at what makes progress possible. Why are some countries rich and others poor? What is it that takes people away from this otherwise eternal fate of living in misery and chronic undernourishment? And then I've researched and written on history, economics, and science, and often with this kind of hopeful, optimistic twist that it's possible to make progress everywhere if we have the right institutions.
Yeah. So I suppose there would be a kind of general acceptance over most of the last century that one of the things which has allowed this progress that you talk of to come about is and has been the mechanisms of capitalism. However, one thing that I've noticed, and I'm sure you're more familiar than anyone with, is just how much fire capitalism has come under in recent years in particular, and even decades. And You know, there's countries like America where maybe 20, 30 years ago, there'd be very, very, very few people talking about socialism as a good thing, or, you know, especially whenever they're fighting the commies as they would have, you know, discussed it in the past. So capitalism was always heralded with people like I suppose your predecessor on the Free to Choose network, Milton Friedman, would have really championed the ideas of capitalism and certainly free markets. So what are your thoughts in terms of, like, why does capitalism get such a bad rep these days?
Yeah, well, I do have two different thoughts on that. One is has very sort of long-term implications, and one is more about the situation we're in right now. So to start with, the long-term one is that, you know, free market capitalism and international trade, to the extent that we have now, is a very recent phenomena. We've only had it in a few countries in the past 200 years. And those 200 years have been quite spectacular for countries who have had those economic freedoms. This is the moment in time, those 200 years, when we increased life expectancy from 30 to 72 years, reduced extreme poverty from 90% around the world to 9% today. And it happened the moment people started getting those freedoms. But it is brand new. We didn't used to live under these circumstances. So if you take the whole of Homo sapiens history and turn it into a 24-hour day, those 200 years, that's just the last minute, the last 60 seconds. That's where our wealth comes from, our technology, our modern science, all of those things, except for one thing: our beliefs, our attitudes, our instincts. They come from the previous 86,400 seconds, probably.
Mhm.
And during that era, uh, uncertainty, dynamic changes, and innovations were quite dangerous, because you lived often close to starvation and threat of other tribes constantly threatening your life, which means that if someone else was successful in that era, if someone else was rich, for example, he probably stole it from you, because you didn't have widespread economic growth so that it could lift all boats. You didn't have innovation that changed people's lives during their lifetime. It took much longer than that. So when we suddenly create a new system whereby, when we have the rule of law, property rights, and a fair government, nowadays you can only get rich on a free market by enriching others somehow, giving them goods, services, technologies that they want to pay for. And that's a great thing. But that's brand new. It used to be that you got rich by killing and stealing. And I think somewhere our instincts are just like that. So if Elon Musk is getting rich, we think that he must be sort of cheating us somehow. If China's exporters are getting rich, we think we are losing out. So that's something that's always there, that fear that if someone else is successful somewhere, it's probably a threat to us. So that's why I think we see this recurring phenomenon of people being hostile to rapid economic change and to capitalism. But I would also add that we do have a problem in our modern Western economies as well with crony capitalism, with many businesses and not the least certain companies in the financial sector who make a killing by living off the public's expense and getting bailouts and subsidies and trade barriers and stuff like that. And the problem is that most people think of that as true capitalism. They are the capitalists,
Yeah.
and they are ripping us off. So then they blame capitalism rather than the governments who do that.
It's the labels. The labels are dangerous, aren't they? Because people can quite easily misassociate, you know, that's capitalism, that's bad. And people who are kind of in defense of capitalism, it's almost like you want to paint the picture. It's like, no, what you're regarding capitalism as being is not actually what it is. You know, it's the situations where governments become so large that it's only through governments becoming increasingly invasive and large, and larger portions of taxation and things like this going in the direction of the public sector and governments, that enables this situation where corporations, as corporations and multinationals, you know, they're really the only entities that have the resources in order to lobby governments to take advantage of these situations. And that's where the crony capitalism comes in. And that's where it's detrimental, I suppose, to kind of the ordinary person. And people kind of mix that up where it's like, if there was more, as my perspective on it anyways, if there was more economic freedoms for the ordinary person and less invasive government, there would therefore be, less opportunity for these monopolies to occur. And that's when
Yeah.
capitalism would actually benefit more ordinary people, as it should in theory. But it's just that somewhere along the way we've kind of got this broken system where it has become crony capitalism, which understandably, it leads me on to my next question, has led more people in recent years to kind of romantically look at the notion of socialism as potentially the thing that we should now move towards. So, being obviously from Sweden yourself, Johan, many people at the moment who are attracted to socialism, they tend to see Sweden as like a bastion, as like the model of socialism working well, and kind of, the Sanders kind of crew in America would probably look at it and think, if they can do that in Sweden, we can do that here. So are they right to do so? And what are your thoughts on this?
This is so strange. I hear this all the time about Sweden being a successful form of socialism. Well, Sweden is a successful society, I would say, and a successful economy. It has been for 150 years. There was only a slight intermission of 25 years when Sweden was lagging behind, losing jobs, losing businesses, and almost collapsing in a terrible economic crisis. And that happens to be the 25 years when we experimented with socialism, the moment in time when we got this reputation for experimenting with those ideas, from roughly 1970 to 1995. That was a brief period. Before that, Sweden was already one of the richest countries on the planet, and it had become so by being a very open economy based on private property, private multinational businesses, always free trade, free markets, limited government, lower taxes than the United States, actually. But then when we got that rich, we thought that, come on, we can now just redistribute it and hand it over to people and help those in need. So the size of the government doubled in some 15 years and everything was regulated. And that it created this reputation. Look, Sweden is successful and yet socialist. Isn't that inspiring? But it's just like that old joke of how do you end up with a small fortune? Well, you start with a large fortune and then you make a couple of mistakes.
Yeah.
And that's what Sweden did. We didn't create a single net job in the private sector for more than 30 years. And we didn't create new businesses. Instead, the ones we had, the IKEAs of Sweden, Tetra Pak and so on, they left Sweden during this period. And it ended in a terrible economic crisis. And actually, no one in Sweden wants to return to that era. You heard it from the socialist Minister of Finance in the early 1990s that this experiment with democratic socialism was perverse, unsustainable, and absurd. So what happened then was that Sweden went back to the future by starting to liberalize its economy again, opening up the product markets, lowering taxes, reducing the size of government. And then Sweden began to set an impressive example to the rest of the world again. So, I mean, if you were paying close attention to Sweden, what most Swedes would tell you is don't do the things that made us successful, not the ones that almost killed us.
Okay. No, that's interesting. It's not necessarily the narrative that people outside of Sweden necessarily hear in terms of the model. So no, that's fascinating. So then in terms of other countries that I know you've visited, like India or even China as an example, what can these countries teach us about the need for free markets?
Well, those are two great examples of how you can limit human potential and how you can liberate it. Because these were two countries that were, until the 1980s, terribly poor and no economic growth, no liberation of human potential. And yet there was this astonishing factor that Indians and Chinese who left India and China were quite successful abroad, starting companies, working hard, being innovative. So there must have been something wrong, not with the people, but with their governments. So then things started happen for various reasons in these places, often in the informal sector. In China, it started with peasants in collectives, communes, who secretly privatized their land because they knew that this was the only way to make sure that people were responsible for how much work they put in, and to experiment with crops and irrigation systems. That started to take off, and only then did the Communist Party set their official stamp of approval, saying, we don't like this, we should send you to labor camps, but apparently it works better than communism, so
Yeah.
perhaps we should allow other collectives to do the same. And in fact, it was the same thing with India in so many ways. I spoke to an Indian economist, Gurcharan Das, who wrote a wonderful book called India Grows at Night. And why does India grow at night? Well, that's because the government and the bureaucrats are asleep at night. So then people could, in agriculture, in their garages, start to tinker and produce stuff. And only in the sectors that were deregulated, for example, say telecoms, it was deregulated because Indian politicians thought that, no, we have no use for telephones here. People are too poor, so we don't have to regulate it. And that happened to be the area where people started to innovate and build major companies that are doing lots of work for Western consumers right now as well. And then again, the official stamp of approval came afterwards. So first you have human creativity bursting through the walls in a way. And then if you're at least sort of mildly, moderately intelligent as a politician, you realize that we should give more people that kind of freedom. And then it started to happen, more economic freedom in these places, in China in the 1980s, in India in the 1990s. And then everything changed. People said that China was hopeless. Now people say, no, they're too successful. People talked about India like, there's this Hindu rate of growth. They can't grow faster than their population. They're doomed to this. Well, yes, but the moment that they liberated markets just a little bit, they increased growth to 5 to 10% a year. So it tells you something about how at least a certain degree of economic freedom can create massive achievements.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. It's also interesting that in those couple of countries, in those examples, it really is it's those pioneers that are really having to take a real risk, at being sent to camps or things like that, that end up changing the entire dynamic of the nation and the future. So without risk, there is no reward, I suppose.
Yeah.
One thing I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on, there are different, let's say, unelected, supragovernmental international organizations which are discussing different things, which are pushing towards this idea of stakeholder capitalism. And to me, what little I know of it, whenever I've read into it, it seems to me this, like in reality, that would be some form of capitalism for the most wealthy, the most rich, and socialism for everyone else. So, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, happen to think that stakeholder capitalism is an incredibly sloppy concept, and it's very difficult to understand what people really mean. And I guess the common denominator is that it's some form of less rough around the edges, less rugged capitalism, and more making sure and taking care of more people and stakeholders. And I think it's almost like the old sort of industrial conglomerates who were supposed to have this patriarchal care of not just the workers but the entire society. I think there are two dangers with this. The first one is that you lose some of the understanding of what businesses are really for. We have this lots of business people nowadays saying that they should give something back to society after having made lots of profits. But wait a minute, if you made your profit not through crony capitalism, not through subsidies or by stealing from people. You got wealthy because you created goods and services that people wanted. You took things, inputs and time that were of less value to people, and turned out something that was more valuable to them so that they wanted to pay more for it. You created an efficient use of society's resources so that we could all do more things and we all become more wealthy. In other words, it's a proof. That profit is proof that you have done something for society. It's not something you should apologize for. And then the second risk is that if you then think that you have something else, and again, this depends on what you really mean with stakeholder society, but there is this risk that it sort of takes the eyes away from the ball, and you start thinking about other things than your core business model, rather this general sort of supervision and care and concern on lots of other things. And the problem then is that many of the great inventions, many of the great changes of business models come from experiments that are unpopular, that lots of people don't like because it threatens incumbents in the economy, it ruins old business models and jobs that are there. So obviously they will be unpopular. And I think I mean, if Edison, when he invented the light bulb, was constantly thinking about sort of what about the rest of community? What about the candle makers and their jobs? They have to be protected. Well, perhaps he shouldn't have invented the light bulb in that case. And there's something dangerous when you don't concern yourself specifically with innovate and experiment to try to come up with better ideas, but rather making everybody happy.
Yeah.
Because that's not, if you try that, you'll the risk is that you won't make anyone happy in the long run.
That what you're saying there, just I'm trying to remember the famous quote that Friedman actually said. It was something like the society that strives for equality before freedom will end up with neither. The society that strives for freedom before equality will end up with a great measure of both. So you can probably tie that in there. But yeah, on the free market side, then I suppose the necessity for them. How, in terms of a mental awareness enlightenment type thing, how can we enlighten people to understand, like just ordinary people all over the world, to understand the need and necessity for free markets, for high economic freedoms, and how those will ultimately benefit the ordinary person, the common man, the common woman?
Yeah. Well, this is something that I think about constantly because this is really my
This
mission.
is the obsession we're talking about here.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So how do you do that? Well, it is difficult because we're partly fighting ourselves and the mental cognitive biases that we have in thinking about us and them and thinking that the world is a zero-sum game rather than the possibility of mutual gain and things like that. So how do you do it? Well, I think you need the data points. I think you constantly have to talk about what has been made possible. I mean, in the last 30 years, we've reduced extreme poverty by more than 140,000 people every day. And where did that happen? It happened in places where people got more freedom, not less freedom. So we have to talk about that. Those data point statistics like that. You also need the stories, I think, about how does this change people's lives individually? How does it make it possible for more people to contribute with their ideas and their thoughts and their innovation to compared to systems that are run by just a couple of guys in the command center in parliaments and so on. And then I think perhaps this is something that I've tried to do a lot, is to get us to not to take our wealth, our opportunity for granted, but think about where does it come from? And that goes for everything. It goes for the computer, the camera, the earphones that we are using now. It goes for where was the book published, the cup of coffee that I'm using. How was that made possible? Because it's the result of tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people cooperating, strangers cooperating on different continents, and not just the beans and roasting the beans, but the infrastructure, putting them in the trucks. And how do you get the steel for those trucks? Well, you need the miners. For those miners, you need someone to make the helmets out of plastics, and then you need the chemicals to make that possible. It's such an astonishing, when you go through the process and think about all the voluntary exchanges taking place there every day among strangers to come up with the end result of me having my cup of coffee there. It's just amazing. And it happened not because some people were told what to do, controlled, or it was planned. And in fact, it wouldn't work if it was planned. It only worked because everybody had the freedom to think about what's in my best interest, to use my time right now in coming up with a slightly better chemical here, or a build this truck over there, or the chair in which the engineer sits when he designs a better truck for making sure that the beans end up there. And they do it constantly, coordinated only through their own free will and the price mechanism. The fact that when we have a certain increase in demand for not just coffee, but perhaps for the trucks or for those helmets, there's a it's like a GPS signal to everybody else. If I want to make money, then I'll move in that direction and try to satisfy those demands. It is an incredible machine that improves the lives of people who have the freedom to move towards those ecosystems of ingenuity and creativity. And I never stopped being amazed by the fact that it works.
Yeah, no, it is. It's fascinating. I suppose one last slight tangent, but different thing that I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on. Obviously, well, Sweden's probably had less so than most countries in the West over the last few months, but all the lockdowns that we're going to have to pay for at some stage in terms of all the subsidies and the grants that have been given out by government, and the kind of current notion is that at some stage down the line, taxes are going to increase for the ordinary person in order to kind of recoup these costs in time. So one thing that I've been looking into is different proposals and different forms of taxation which have been brought up over the years. And I know that there's a concept that I've been reading up on recently, and it's one which Milton Friedman was actually, I think he said it was the least bad tax ever proposed, and it was Henry George's land tax. And again, this ties in now with, I've just heard in the last couple of weeks that a certain gentleman who's in the news pretty much every day for other reasons has just bought up more land in America than any other person. And we're at the stage now where different natural resources like land are being gobbled up in different ways by, again, the elitely wealthy. So the land tax concept would effectively, I think the idea behind it is, if there are two plots of land, two neighbors living right beside each other, one doesn't do anything with it and the land just sits there, and the other person has a big massive Trump tower on it. Both neighbors are charged the same tax because it's taxed on the unimproved value of land. So effectively what that tax does is it really puts a requirement on you to utilize the land that you have rather than just gobbling it up and sitting on it, and hoarding it in effect. So that's one form of taxation which I think could help level the playing field for the ordinary person. If those people who were kind of, accumulating all sorts of different natural resources had to actually pay a cost for that, and a directly proportional cost for that. So, do you think that this concept is there's any merit to it, or are there any other kind of concepts or things that we should be pushing towards, which will, if adopted, would ultimately benefit the ordinary person?
Yeah, well, first of all, I share your worry. We're now seeing in rich countries that the general debt level is around 100, public debt is around 120% of GDP. I mean, when we had the huge debt crisis in emerging economies in the 80s, the people were shocked because they had like 70% of GDP or something. Those economies won't survive this. Well, how are we going to survive this? There will be some great difficulties ahead. And yes, then we're going to have to think about not just cutting spending, but also taxes. And I agree. But the first principle that I have is that make sure that you destroy as little as possible, because that's really what taxation is. I mean, it's as someone put it, is taxes is a kind of a fine on doing good things, whereas fines are a kind of tax on bad things. You put it on tobacco and alcohol or pollution because you don't like alcohol, tobacco, and pollution. But hey, why in that case do we put it on work and investment and in taking risks? It's just crazy. So my preferred solution would be to minimize as much as possible taxes on doing good things, useful things, and especially work and investing in the future. But and where do we put it? Well, we put it on things that we don't like. Pollution is one such example. It's not a bad idea to put making sure that polluter pays for what they do. But then when it comes to George's land tax, I agree with Milton Friedman. I think it's the least bad tax that I've heard of, because it does not destroy any kind of incentive to work or invest. It's a tax on an increase in value that you're not responsible for, but it just happens because of the general changes in society and demand for land. And on the contrary, it creates, as you pointed out, an incentive to actually develop your land and make something profitable there, rather than just gobbling up resources. So I'm surprised that this hasn't been attempted more in more places.
Cool. That's definitely something to look more into then. No, that's I'm glad that you feel that way. So now I have more incentive myself to dig down that rabbit hole anyway. But anyway, I suppose last thing I've asked some recent guests the same question to finish on. Is there anything you're particularly excited about for the remainder of 2021 and beyond?
Well, yeah, hopefully that the world opens up again. Because
I know,
and
I need a tan. Like I need to get out to Croatia or something soon.
Yeah, exactly. So it's partly because I have to get out of this living room at some point, because doing a book tour from your living room, it's not as fun as actually going out there and meeting people. But also I think for the whole of society, this has been an experiment in seeing what a non-globalized world looks like, putting global capitalism on hold for 6 months, and the result is a global depression and probably 100 million people thrown into extreme poverty. It's awful. We have to get out of this as soon as possible, to make sure that we rebuild economies and opportunities for people, but also I think to rebuild trust. We have to meet one another once in a while, and we have to meet strangers, because when we just watch them on TV, they look strange and odd to me. You really need interaction constantly, I think, to make societies function. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose just last thing, when you're mentioning your book, how's everything going with that? And do you want to just tell us a bit more about your book?
Yeah, sure. It's open, the story of human progress, and it's about openness, but also about being closed. Because my theory is that, and it's no surprise to you, that history's progress is built on openness, because that's what sets human beings apart from all the other animals. We are very good at cooperating with strangers, which means that we are traders by nature. We can use the brains, the ideas, the skills of everybody else. So if someone stumbles onto a better way of making fire or a COVID-19 vaccine, we can all use it. So that's why we're so successful. And that's why we have to open up as much as possible to make sure that more people can contribute. But we are double-natured, and this is the problem. We are also closed-minded once in a while. We expand the tribe when we feel safe, but when we feel worried, we kind of retreat behind strong men and big governments and tariff barriers and walls against the rest of the world, because that's how we historically protected ourselves from a raiding band or a storm or something like that. And this is why often in times of economic depressions, natural disasters, or pandemics, people want the big government to protect them, basically. And we start to divide us and them and look for scapegoats to explain all our problems. And I am trying to convince people that every problem is not a raiding band anymore. It's not a strong man that we want, and we shouldn't kill strangers. We should cooperate with them to accumulate more knowledge and come up with more solutions. If not, we will shoot ourselves in the foot. Basically, that's what the book is about. And so far, even though I've not been on a real life book tour, I've actually been able to be present at more events and do more interviews about the book, because I just have to get out of my pajamas to do this stuff.
At least in the upper half, you can still be wearing
exactly.
bottoms,
that's all it takes. And the translations are coming out now in Dutch and in Japanese and in Spanish and so on. So I'm very happy about the reception.
Will there be an audiobook version?
I don't know. I have to ask my publisher about that. I hope we'll see about that.
Good stuff. Good stuff. I just prefer listening to audiobooks myself, so I need to get on it either way.
Yeah.
All right, nice. Johan Norberg, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. I will get reading your book, and I'll let you know how I get on with that. And yeah, I share your sentiments and hope that things will open up as soon as possible, back to normality.
Yeah, we're looking forward to the roaring 20s after.
Well, we'll see. It's gonna be an interesting year anyway. Get through 21 first. All right, thank you, Johan.
Yeah. Thank you. It was a pleasure. Take care.
Cheers. Well, many cool takeaways there. Thanks again to Johan Norberg for coming on the show and sharing his wisdom, experience, and thoughts with us. What I'll do is I'll put links to Johan's new book in the description below, at the top of the description below in the YouTube video if you click into it. And I'll also link all his different social media platforms so you can follow him in different channels. So yeah, for more authentic conversations like today, for more challenging, good information, subscribe. Much love. God bless. Keep the faith.